Welcome to the first episode or edition of the 1940 Reader podcast. Toby and I have been experimenting with been playing with the idea of trying to do something around this. So I think the read along we're currently doing of Professor Tony Hopkins' book, Capitalism and the Colonies, that we're reading, presents an opportunity for us to try out one. So what we're trying to do here is not so much discuss the chapters in the book that will be going on along in our reviews, but where we want to discuss some broader themes around what we are reading, we decided to do maybe just a quick short podcast to explore just explore those ideas in a bit more depth. So I think the first thing we want to do today is discuss the idea of a distinction between trade and markets and how we can confuse both of them and what history tells us about this and modern day Nigeria. So Toby, welcome.
Thanks, V. Thanks. It's always a pleasure doing anything with you, and this is no exception.
Okay, great. So I think let's kick into it. So I think obviously the first thing is we want to do a kind of distinction between natural trade and constructed markets. So markets that are man-made, if you like. They didn't just fall down from the sky. And I think this is something I always say. Markets don't just happen. People build them, and that distinction between what is natural trade, which is a point you've been making, is that there is no culture where you cannot find trade. People will always trade, whether even before there was money, they will trade by barter or that sort of thing. So, and constructed market, which is not something you will find everywhere. So that distinction is fundamental to understanding the evolution and development of an economy. And trade is a universal human activity, as we just said, rooted in the direct exchange of goods and services. And markets are complex institutions that require a legal framework to underpin them, to make them work. And maybe things like standardization and enforceable contracts. For them to keep functioning effectively. So let's probably start off. I think maybe if you want to start, what is that fundamental distinction between trade and markets as with trade being that universal human activity?
So you know that you and I have been having some form of conversations around development, what makes countries prosperous for, I would say, about 15 years now. And we know that an essential part of that process, at least if we look at some of the countries that have been successful in the past 5 decades, basically the East Asian so-called miracles, a point you always make is that they manage to create markets in certain industries that they eventually come to dominate. So, the entire industrialization process of East Asian giants like Singapore, Taiwan, South Korea were basically just starting up industries that did not exist before they started making conscious policy decisions to start those industries. So it makes you think about, okay, so what is the process of market creation? And then you start thinking about the rules that underline those policies. And they may not look the same in different contexts, but there are always rules that underline the, or maybe let's just say that maybe certain heuristics. The reading Hawkins, it just occurred to me that if you look at colonial Lagos, at least the way he told the story, even before the arrival of the British, you could find trade. And it's universal in almost any culture. There is always some form of exchange, whether it is barter or some kind of rudimentary monetary system. There is always trade. But the important thing to note, like you said in your intro, is that market is an institution. And it's very easy to confuse that sometimes either maybe from people who are somewhat oriented towards free markets or people who are opposed to it. Usually we are describing trade and exchanges when we talk about markets. We are talking about what people would normally do, what they engage in, how they exchange ideas or goods and services. But where you find markets, which is usually correlated with growth or some form of expansion of that activity, right? You would find markets. And the crucial distinction, to answer your question, between trade and markets is that there are always formal rules that are enforceable, rules that can be held as a promise. Let me put it that way. That, okay, this thing, this contract, this agreement, whatever it is, you can defend it anyway. You can hold me to this agreement. You can hold me to this obligation, right? I'm not going to welch or I'm not going to back out, right? And if I did, there is usually a prescribed set of consequences that follows. Sometimes it might be lethal, sometimes it might be mild, but they are always well defined so that all parties participating in those transactions are aware of what they are doing. And another thing that I think is important to point out here is that, and this is important when we think about regulations versus markets, what you usually find is that rather than the way we've come to think about regulation today, which is certainly not wrong in certain contexts, is that rules that create markets usually bring growth and not otherwise. Even if you're dealing in a certain commodity or good that is supposedly free, like everybody can trade it, you can engage in. Once you have rules that bring some form of standardization, some sort of uniformity, or again, enforceable promise into that trade, as opposed to what people would normally assume, that those, you find that this set of rules tend to grow that particular activity, because then I think this brings us to the second feature of rules that creates markets then makes contracts or trade or exchanges almost infinitely tradable. As you can see with, the book we are reading with Tony Hawkins, you have African merchants here in Lagos doing business in London, in Manchester, in Liverpool, with people that they can't see. At a time when communication technology was not so advanced, and messages usually get delivered in 2 to 3 months. But it is those contracts, it is those rules, and of course the institutions you build to back them, like the courts and other forms of adjudication process, that makes those exchanges almost infinitely tradable. And that is where the growth comes from.
Right. So that's a really good intro, and like you said, one of the things that struck me, as you were talking a lot about it, is that the person who sets up a market has to be, to some extent, a disinterested party, right?
Yeah.
So, I have to be able to set up a market whereby it's just not favoring me, or I don't intervene arbitrarily. So, like you said, that growth comes from when that thing is enforceable. And I think, obviously the best example, one of the best examples in this book, it might not be obvious, but it's the Crown Grant system. So when the British came and decided, they made a sort of system for land. And all of a sudden, mortgages came out of nowhere. Things that previously didn't exist. People were able to unlock credit from the property they owned. Previously, everything was just, just in the typical way where you own land. It was almost kind of like owning land for prestige sake. But all of a sudden now you have land where, that crown grant is recognizable, is enforceable. and you can lend against it, it unlocks credit for you. So the person who does that, I mean, if I was to set up a land system, right, and I said, you get a land certificate for anything you own, and you can trade it, and by once you have that paper, then nobody else can take it away from you.
Yep.
That restricts the authorities from saying, for example, I mean, if somebody could just actually just send in soldiers and take away, or send in the military or use force and take away your land, whether or not you own that piece of paper, then that piece of paper becomes useless in the sense. So the person who is designing that market, or enforcing those rules, has to an extent, stand back and be disinterested and say, okay, let this thing flow, let the rules govern this. So I think that's quite an interesting point. I think the other thing I wanted to ask you though was, in terms of these markets, right? I mean,
Yeah.
what is the trigger for the development of a market? Is it a push or pull thing? So people, because like you said, people can be trading for centuries,
Yes.
and then somebody will just come and show up, and they might not even know that they need a market, or they don't know that they need a market system, and then somebody shows up, designs a new market system, and all of a sudden, all the trade that had been happening before becomes exponential, and growth happens. People get even wealthier than they imagined. So what is the trigger in terms of, that leads to the development of the market? Do people demand it, or is just somebody who just comes with fresh eyes and looks at it and say, okay, actually, we people here's something that we can do different, or is it just a flow of ideas, in the sense that if you are in a country that has had markets, and then you go to another country that doesn't have markets, you can then just say, oh, here's something that's missing? Or is it just the natural traveling of ideas around the world?
I think I'm fairly biased towards the push theory, especially if we look at the history of it. I mean, today we may want to put emphasis on ideas, given that with globalization and every other things that come to influence domestic policies like geopolitics and so many other things, you may say, okay, like we always say, the power example, or maybe Ghana is doing well because there were some things they are doing right, and you feel like, oh yeah, we can copy that in Nigeria, But if we look at it historically, markets are fairly recent, right? Trade is like as old as humanity itself, but markets are fairly recent. I'm not an expert here, but I would put the development or the history of markets at sometimes between mid to late 19th century, like in the real legal institutional sense. And it's not that much of a coincidence that that sort of coincided with the Industrial Revolution, and particularly the second phase of it, when America sort of joined the party. So I think markets are intentional. Someone with particularly strong incentives towards a particular outcome. I like one word you used, I mean, a few minutes ago, which is design. Markets are usually designed. And again, markets that aren't working, I know we don't usually think of it, are usually a design problem. Right? So you have to look at the kinks, you have to look at the parts that are not working for you to fix it. We treat it as a political problem, or sometimes as a philosophical problem. So we tend to talk about things like democracy and freedom. But market, you can have all those things, and you might have terrible, inefficient markets that achieve not so great outcomes if you don't take the design part of it seriously. I think this brings me to people like Alvin Roth, which I'm sure you're familiar with. And so in his work, he made one observation that markets that are efficient have three features, basically. One is that you have to be thick. If we want to put that in political terms, I mean, Ismoglu and Robinson just won the Nobel, will say that markets have to be inclusive.
Yeah.
That good markets are not ones that exclude people for arbitrary reasons, right? So markets have to be thick. And secondly, he said that markets have to be safe. Again, it takes us back to the promise. That is your promise. You have to be confident to act on the information you have for you to participate in a market. And the same goes for every other party, that is doing a transaction or any particular exchange. And the third thing, which Averrod pointed out, is that markets have to be able to solve the congestion problems that the thickness brings.
Yeah.
Right? And that takes us to the efficiency question. So I guess what that means is that a party that is not strongly incentivized to keep looking into where markets break down and where they fail to achieve some of these ends, they are likely to be very unsustainable. So I would be very much biased towards, the push factor. As we saw with like the history of Lagos, the British were very, very interested in the legitimate commerce, which was palm oil, right? And they were committed to the point where the incentives changed, obviously, to make that work, because we are going to end slavery. Obviously, there is something else that has to fill this void. And while, as Hawkins pointed out, for a lot of people who were involved in that value chain, palm oil was not so profitable as a slave trade.
Yeah. Definitely, relative to slavery, definitely.
Yeah. So, I mean, you have to be able to at least create some kind of wealth for stakeholders in the newcomers if you want it to like take hold. So markets needs a very strongly incentivized designer. I'll put it that way.
Okay, cool. That's good stuff. I think maybe in the notes for this podcast, I'll probably include Alvin Roth's book. And there's also another book I read many years ago, which I really enjoyed. It's called The Inner Lives of Markets. It's quite fun.
Yeah,
Anyone can read it.
That was a good one.
Yeah, and and one of the most interesting stories in the book was this eBay, which is kind of like the perfect idea of a market, if you like. You create this platform, sellers come, sell their goods, buyers come, they negotiate between themselves, and eBay takes a cut. And that's just a functioning market. And before you know it, it has become the number one platform in the world where you can literally sell anything on eBay. I mean, right now, every time I need to sell something in the house, maybe I have some old gadget or some old iPad or phone or something I want to get rid of, I just go on eBay. It's amazing how it is guaranteed to find a buyer. Like if I put a phone there, I will get someone from somewhere who needs that thing. And they've created that platform whereby they became and if they didn't get there, in this case, the technology, the legal underpinnings and a clear definition of, hey, here are the rules. If somebody bids this, here is what we'll take, and between the two of you, we'll moderate it. So we'll take the money. Once you confirm you've received it, we'll send it out to you. Just being that referee, and just boosted it. So I think that brings me to probably our next question, the next question, or the next thing I want to describe. So the legal system, the role of the role of a legal system in the creation of a market. So I imagine that you cannot go and create a market in a war zone. I mean, you probably can, but your job is harder. So the underlying conditions have to sort of, they play a big role. So the markets are one thing, but the underlying legal conditions, it says that it's one thing for you to have rules, but are those rules actually enforceable? So I want to talk about how did that work in Lagos. So when the British began to create markets in there, what's your thoughts or your thinking about how the introduction of the British common law in Lagos helped to underpin this enforceability of contracts and generally having a marketplace for things like land, mortgages, and credit.
Yeah, so I mean that's an interesting part because I mean one thing you said, the underlying conditions. First of all, you can say that you can create a market in a war zone. I know we know that you need to have peace, right? You need to have a party with an actual legitimate monopoly of violence. I think by if there was any doubt, by 1861, it was pretty clear in Lagos who is in charge, like who is running things. You know, no slave trade means no slave trade, no exceptions. Right? So you either move somewhere else or you adjust, which a lot of people merchant, I mean, the famous Daniel Taiwo, who can qualify as Houdini here with his adaptability act, you know, that he managed to pull off. So you need to have peace. You need to have a party with that can actually enforce, you know, whatever rules that you make. And yeah, the introduction of you talked about the crown grants, the British common law. You can see that it was a bit of a mess, the way disputes were dealt with, the way informal contracts were handled, the way it was like, it was so informal. And we can say that while that works for, and I think this is important to like point out, that markets can also become outdated when the structure of the activity or the economy changes, right?
Yeah.
So, I mean, initially, the institutions, the informal institutions that sort of kept the slave trade going was adopted for the new legitimate commerce, but it proved insufficient. You know, it couldn't really deal with
You couldn't cope
the
with, yeah,
it couldn't
yeah.
cope with the complexities that brings. You understand? Because now you're doing something entirely different, you know, right? Even if you are adopting some of the old means, right? So you need something new, obviously. And the introduction of British commerce sort of sanitized the process mainly because of the court system. You know, you could actually go to court. Like you said, there's an unbiased, in quotes, I know some people would have my head for that, you know, party that would look at the cases, I mean, against the backdrop of the whole colonial arrangement and say, okay, here are the facts, here is what's going on, and, you know, this is my ruling. And I recall I was listening, I forgot his name now completely. I was listening to a lecture by a retired British judge. And one of the things that he said that struck me during that lecture was that the most important person in a courtroom is the accused, because that person has to walk away with a feeling of having been fairly treated.
Even
You
if it
know,
goes against him.
even if you rule against him or her, you know, that person has to feel like, okay, yeah, justice has been done, and you know, I probably deserve this. So again, if you look at some of the contractual disputes in the early Lagos, they were really contentious, but you could see that there is a general trust in that
Yes.
system.
Yeah.
You know,
I mean,
there
that
was
was why someone like Taiwo Olowo, you know, who was an illiterate, but
yeah.
you find that what you find from the book is that every little dispute, this guy will go to court.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, this is a guy who was an area father. You
Yeah,
know,
yeah.
he had a lot of thugs. He had boys everywhere who could enforce violence for him. and he was stark illiterate, but he spent so much money on lawyers in the sense that, as soon as any dispute happened, he went to court, he trusted us, or even JPL Davis.
Yeah.
The case against him in Ghana, it collapsed because there were rumors and suggestions that the creditors, the British creditors who came from Manchester, were trying to influence maybe the jury or the judges against him, and the judge just threw out the case. And it's kind of remarkable when you think about it in the sense that here are some white men coming from Europe. This is late 19th century. They're trying to rig a case against the black man, and the judge just throws out the case. So that point you made is really critical in the sense that even if you lose a case, at least have a feeling that okay, the process was fair. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's important that the rules are fairly enforced. So we can have markets that are clearly set up to achieve some specific ends. We are not moralizing here and saying that all markets are good. The markets in weapons, for example, you may have some moral quibbles about it. But the importance of the rules, the enforceabilities of the rule, and the trust of all parties participating in that market is very central to whatever system it is, whatever rules you write. So it's important. So I think where I would like to take us, if I could pose you my own question, would be that the infrastructure is also quite important to market creation. Again, if we go back to the story we are currently reading, the importance of the port infrastructure in Lagos was quite central to that trade. The expansion of it, the growth of it, the accessibility of it. And we could also say that the breakdown of that infrastructure was the source of the tension, at least away from Lagos. If you consider the participation of the Egbas, the Ijebus, the Ibadans, and how they sort of disrupted the supply chain, in question. So what do you think is the role of infrastructure in market creation?
Well, it's clearly important. One of the things I've been trying to do while reading the book is, sometimes I just try and close my eyes and just try and imagine Marina, because there's a lot of description of Marina in the book in terms of, oh, this person had number 50 Marina, which was the store where they held goods, and then from there they put them on boats, or they bring produce from the hinterland and that kind of thing. So just trying to imagine that, and as we go through the book, you can see that infrastructure was definitely important, because before the British came, and they came with their crown grants and all that kind of stuff, Marina was just, I don't get the sense that it was anything maybe slightly developed for slave trade. But I imagine that if a place is being used to sell slaves, then it's a no-go area for a lot of people. So it's not to put it mildly, if a place is being used for slave trade, then it's not a tourist attraction. You don't want to be hanging around there. And this is something that, for example, the guy who is in folklore, who is said to be the father of the Jaws, I think the name comes something like Alagbawiye. That was the name of the guy. And when you think about places like all this Bonny Island and all those places, and this is not just something exclusive to the Niger Delta. All across the coast of Nigeria, people were selling slaves, but those islands were carved out specifically for slaving. So they bring slaves there, and then they trade with the white man, or even in Benin. One of the things I learned about some years ago, which I wrote about, was how the Oba of Benin at the time, he came up with a policy that was unique, almost across. I've never heard of it anywhere else, but unique across sub-Saharan Africa, where he created a new market to sell only female slaves, because he was fighting a lot of wars, and he didn't really want to sell too many men. And one of the things that we don't really think about is just that you cannot breed slaves. Even if you set up a farm and put 1,000 women there, and you have people first of all, you cannot predict, the value of a male slave is not the same as the value of a female slave. And
Mm-hmm.
a woman will have, if at most, maybe she will have 2 kids in 1 year, you know, and then what, even as a baby is not a slave. You cannot use more. So you need a long period of time, maybe 15 years if you are lucky, or 18 years, and which is why if the supply of slaves increases, then violence is the only way, because to boost that. So if the demand increases, the only way to boost that supply is by violence, so capturing people. So the Oba of Benin at that time, he actually created a new market entirely, and he put it far away from Benin town, and he only supplied females there as slaves. And so the people who came to buy, they could only find women. So you find that, and this is coming back to the infrastructure point, whereby a kind of place where you use for slaving is a completely different type of infrastructure. For the British introduced the common law, and they introduced things like the crown grant. You can see how, as we go through the book, you can see constantly, you constantly hear also, oh, he bought number 50 Marina, he bought number 10 Marina, and he opened a warehouse, he had a store there, that sort of thing. So in the background of the book, you can see the development of infrastructure for a new type of trade, in the sense that now you have a warehouse, you can bring palm oil or cocoa or whatever from the hinterland, you bring it, and this is where I will store the goods, and then we can exchange, and then you export some, and then maybe when you or maybe when I export palm oil, and then I import things like one of the things they mentioned in the book was Japanese padlocks, for example. You need a place to store them from. So definitely without that infrastructure, and another point he mentioned about infrastructure is the barracoons that were used for
Yeah,
slavery. So
yeah,
this is
yeah.
just basically, I mean, that was a rare case of slavery infrastructure being convertible to its
Repurposed. Yeah, yeah.
purpose. Yeah, but it wasn't all of them. It was very rare. So the barracoons that were used to store slaves could then be used to store palm oil. But markets definitely and infrastructure have to happen. And while we're talking about Lagos, colonial Lagos gives us an opportunity to look at it almost kind of like a ground zero type thing, moving from one type of trade, slave trade, which was almost incompatible with a legitimate commerce, and then seeing how things change and things grow. I mean, in the West or in other countries, we can take a lot of these things for granted. Maybe things like the canals, when the US were building the canals, or even the railroads when they were building the railroads in the US, in the UK, that sort of thing. So those things, they make it possible. I mean, something I've been reading lately is a book about the development of uh, refrigeration, in the sense that
Mm,
how it's a book called Frostbite, and basically the history of refrigeration and how humans started to refrigerate food for storage. And one of the ways in the early days, when people first started harvesting ice from, right, and
mm.
then you load the train with ice, and cover the meat in it, and then and then maybe you're going to Georgia. I mean, this is obviously a very, very long distance, but at various points along that journey, he has set up ice storage places. So when the train gets to those places, they load more ice, and then move on again. Maybe they move another 200 miles, load more ice at this junction. So it was quite fascinating. So that kind of infrastructure sprang up as the need for refrigeration. And, it's a point that is easy to miss, in the sense that we have, you and I enjoy talking about economics and economic theories, and is a point that can be very easily missed when we're talking about the development of policies and all that. The stuff that is happening in the background, that that is happening simultaneously, and is as important as the policies, the contracts, and all of that stuff, but the infrastructure that is enabling that happening. So I think, yeah, this is definitely important. And while you might not see it, or you might not notice it, or it might look like it's happening in a completely different world, but that infrastructure, especially in Lagos gives us a perfect example to observe this, because what was happening there before slavery, with the kind of infrastructure that it needed, could just not work for palm oil, with the rare exception of a small number of cases. So yeah, that's infrastructure is important. You probably cannot get a market to its potential without the supporting infrastructure develop alongside it.
Yeah. So I mean, just to recap, we've touched on a few things now in terms of market creation. We've talked about the rules, we've talked about the enforceability slash trust of it. We've talked about a trusted third party, that can adjudicate fairly without largely without bias. We've talked about infrastructure. One thing I was hoping you mentioned was the arrival of telegraph, in Lagos, and how that cut
Yeah,
communications from months to
communication time.
weeks
Yeah,
and
to weeks.
days,
Yeah.
and how that even further exploded, the
You
trade
see,
and the
this is
contracts.
exactly the point we were talking about, whereby if you have a bias for economics and all those kind of things, you might miss all these things happening. In the sense that that's a really good example again of the telegram. I mean, I remember reading the book about it's called the Kings of Shanghai, about some Jewish people who set up business in China and all that. And you'll be amazed at how the telegraph played a role in opium. I mean, without the telegraph, the opium market, the drug markets could almost certainly not have worked. So this is a case where obviously it was happening for uh unwholesome reason, if you like, but definitely, side by side with the development of the markets is always those things that are almost invisible or unseen.
Mm. So, I mean, where I was going, I mean, a contemporary example that always come to my mind is when I think of the growth of fintechs in Nigeria and how something as simple as the NIBSS infrastructure has enabled the growth of that whole industry, and how even the regulation, the rules were not even as damaging as people first, and but the point I was going to make is that speaking of infrastructure, I want you to resolve some kind of paradox. Let's take a stab at it. Is that if you look at growth retarding regimes like communist, socialists, and all these people, Stalin, Maduro, Buhari, all these people, there's always some form of obsession or infrastructure porn, if you like, you know, like doing big projects, bridges, roads. They never run out of roads, railways, and it never really brings growth. Do you think like the intentionality of market creation is what is missing? What are your thoughts here?
Yeah, so that's actually a really good point. There was what's the name of this guy who was the Thailand prime minister, the one who got exiled? Uh,
Taxing.
Thaksin. Yeah. So one of the things that I read about many years ago was how they used to call him Mr. Pothole in Thailand. Basically, that guy used roads as purely as a tool to buy rural support. You know, so and I think this brings us back to the earlier point you made about how what brings the market to a place is it pull or push, and infrastructure can be a push thing. So Shinawatra saw roads as a way to solidify his base. The elite hated him in Thailand. They hated him because they felt that this guy is a dangerous kind of guy who is so populist. Getting people to wear T-shirts on his behalf. What kind of nonsense is that? Yeah, behavior is that kind of thing. But he used roads to buy support of so many people in the rural parts of Thailand. So from somebody like that, he was building roads not to enable any kind of market, but just to basically get these people to vote for him. And we see a lot of that in Nigeria as well today, where I mean, a governor, the first thing they want to do is build roads because it's the most visible thing they can show. They don't. There's no and a road is never tied to say this road was built and you unlocked so billions of naira worth of trade, or there's this trade that is happening along this axis. If we build this road, that trade can go 3x, or we can increase that trade by 300% without, and then the road will pay for itself over time. You never hear stuff, you never hear stuff like that. So, the infrastructure paradox here, like you mentioned, is that infrastructure can also be pull or push in the sense that a market is developing and it will quickly become obvious what kind of infrastructure is needed. So when merchants in Lagos started to trade in goods, in the sense that you are getting palm oil, you are bringing it from the hinterland, you are going to store it for a while, and then put it on a ship. And when that ship arrives, you don't want ships to go back empty. When that ship arrives, it's going to bring goods, your quote unquote Japanese padlocks and all that kind of stuff. So once you get the stuff of the ship, then you need to then exchange it and give it, and then you store all the things, or the clothes, the damask, all those kind of things. You need a place to store this because you can't sell it immediately and all that. So once you start to dabble in that kind of trade or in that kind of market, then automatically the need what you need becomes obvious. You need storage in the sense that can facilitate the flow of goods and services as you're doing it. So that kind of thing, I think as the market grows, it almost specifies or demands its own infrastructure, But you can imagine, where somebody just decides that, oh, this marina looks nice, let us build warehouses. Yeah. And then this is how you end up with white elephants, as they say. The underlying demand wasn't there. And I think one example I'll use, while it's not exactly a market type thing, but it's just a question of, it gives an example of how governments can do this type of thing. So, many years ago, well, not many years ago, but the Thai government, they've always engaged in what you might call gastro diplomacy, exporting their food as a way of boosting Thai culture. Now, I mean, the story is kind of well known about how the Thai government actually invented pad Thai. They did a competition and asked people that, okay, create a kind of Thai food that we can export across the world. And then pad Thai won, and the government sponsored it. And now today, it's kind of like the most popular Thai food around. But so one of the things that the Thai government did was that to export Thai food, they were backing Thai chefs to go to different countries. Now, they came to the UK and they were very clever. So I think they gave the chefs a very small amount of money, a small amount of capital. Let's just assume, for say £10,000, and say, okay, go out there, find a way you can set up. Now, those Thai chefs, what they did was that they got into partnership with pubs. So you have a lot of pubs in the UK that standard, most of them have a kitchen, right? But over time, as pub culture has been sort of on a downturn, a lot of pubs have been closing over time. Those kitchens ended up maybe not really being in use. So now in London and a few other areas, in some random areas, you just go to a pub and you see that they sell fantastic Thai food. And then when you inquire for that, you find out that, oh, there's a Thai chef that is actually operating out of there in the kitchen. So this was a perfect match in the sense that Thai food goes well with alcohol, the spice and all that kind of thing. So these Thai chefs, they came and said, okay, you know what, we'll boost your business for you. You can allow us to use your kitchen at a very, very reduced rate, or sometimes even free. For the pub landlord, he's not losing anything. It's just another opportunity for him to sell stuff, or to sell stuff, or even sell more beer, that kind of thing. So that partnership worked quite well, and so many of them are still around. In fact, there was one around near me here, which had some fantastic Thai food around. Now, the Malaysian government tried to copy that some years later or something. Now, what the Malaysian government did was they basically found some Malaysian chefs, gave them huge amounts of money, I don't know, maybe 50,000 or 100,000 pounds, and told them, go to London and do quote unquote gastro diplomacy. And what did the Malaysian chefs do? They came here and they were renting spaces to open Malaysian restaurants. Now, anyone who knows anything about London restaurants is that one of the things that happens is that every year, roughly 30 or 40% of restaurants in London close down. New ones open, but there's a high turnover. And one of the biggest reasons is that rent. That if you open a restaurant in London, if the restaurant is not a hit, you are pretty much just working for the landlord. So then take that kind of money from the government and then just jump into London and go and start renting restaurants. Of course, many of them failed.
I think
In fact, the vast majority of
it was one economist I forgot. Is it Tim Harford? Yeah, that said
yeah,
like restaurants are basically in the real estate business and not the food
exactly.
business.
Exactly. So this is a case where you can see how a government can push something in the wrong direction, whereas for the Thai guys, it was almost a match made in heaven, where the pubs needed more business. They had this real estate that was already there, that was not in use, and then there was a natural kind of budget, and then you have the Thai chefs who are actually looking for this. So this thing can happen organically, in a lot of ways, but the hand of government can intervene to start pushing things in the wrong direction. So I think with the infrastructure, uh, we should have the kind of infrastructure that is necessary and that is successful is the what we might call maybe the market-led infrastructure, in the sense that the market is leading and it is pointing to the way that this is the kind of infrastructure that we needed. I think the development that we saw in Marina, uh, eh, as Professor Hopkins describes in the book, it would definitely not have happened without the growth in legitimate trade. You know, you are not going to do warehouses. In fact, what we know is that by 1807, when the slave trade had become officially illegal, what had happened was that a lot of the barracoons had moved inland where they were just hiding people, and the
Yeah.
whole idea was that you know they'll be watching. They'll hide the slaves in some kind of caves or underground caves, and then somebody will be watching the marina for the Royal Navy boat lights. So once the light has crossed this way, people kind of know that okay, they've gone, and maybe they might come back in another 2 days or something. Then they'll bring out the slaves, rush them to the port, put them in illegal boats, and then ship them. Obviously, many of them were still caught anyway, which is how we ended up with the Saro. But that kind of infrastructure has an incentive to be far away from the port because they were hiding from the authorities. So but once you started having legitimate trade, then you wanted to be closer, which was what then gave us the marina. So I think in that scenario, the market-led infrastructure is the best. But where you have active governments nowadays, is almost you're almost asking them to do something impossible. I mean, telling a governor to only build roads because there's to boost trade is asking for the impossible, really. The governor is
Mm,
just going to build road because he wants votes.
mm,
So
mm,
sometimes the incentives
mm.
of democracy might clash with the incentives of a market.
I think that was gonna be my next point slash question. So like, what do you think are the underlying? I mean, if we look at the history of Lagos, what do you think are the underlying incentives that that creates that push to want to like create markets that that works? Because I see a lot of development problems as the problems of market creation. If we telegraph a lot of what we are learning about history today, it's basically where I think we are failing, woefully. We want to regulate. We never really try to create. I mean, we've been talking about electricity in Nigeria at least since democracy now and the Electricity Reform Act of 2005 or whatever. But no, but you'll find that nobody is really seriously thinking about creating an electricity market. The same thing if you expand it to energy, yes, we have an oil and gas industry in quote, but we have a badly broken energy market. And nobody is really thinking about the rules and every other element and all the surrounding infrastructure to make that work. So, like, what are the incentives that you've observed in places where markets have worked and done wonders? Obviously, for the British, it was like the abolition of the slave trade, which sort of brought them. So, like, what are the other parallels in recent history that you can point to where they might be ancillary in terms of intentionality, but they eventually led to market creation.
Yeah, so that's a that's a really good point. I mean, when you talk about energy, that's just electricity is just a almost kind of like the perfect example because an electricity market, electricity is one of the places where you absolutely have to have a market for it to work. If you don't have a market, it's not going to work. And and the fundamental reason is that household users are one type of people. You know, everybody should have electricity basically. Everybody should have electricity 24/7. But you cannot discriminate on the basis of saying somebody so you cannot afford electricity, so therefore you shouldn't have it. And that's where the market works in the sense that I mean one of the things that came out here in the UK during COVID was that when we're all in lockdowns, it became clear that the fact of the reality is that office buildings and industries are subsidizing the consumption of households in a
Mm.
sense. So during COVID, when all the office buildings and all that were shut down because nobody was going into the offices, the electricity market came under serious stress because obviously you can't just double my electricity bill and say I should start paying you now. But you can you can charge more to industries, to offices and all commercial premises, and then once you pull all of once you pull all of that together, then it allows me to have electricity but at a reduced price. So, that kind of market making is the only way an electricity market can function. The incentives, a remarkably underrated incentive, I think, is just basically livability,
Mm.
right? It sounds like a woolly type thing, but the reality is that an incentive will be to make Lagos a more livable place for people.
Mm.
Just because Lagos right now it's a
It-
nightmare.
yeah,
It's a nightmare.
basically.
Transport is terrible. Transportation is terrible. Electricity is terrible. Even just walking around even if you go to what we call sorry, what you call a market, um, in Lagos. If you go around those places, sorry, let me. Let me call this up.
Sorry.
Yeah. Well,
Mm.
yeah. If you go around a market is just so disorganized. If you want to go to a market to buy things now, for example, I don't think the experience is a pleasant one for anybody. In fact, I'm sure there are people you can hire to just do the market shopping for you, and all those businesses have sprung up over there because
Oh yeah,
going
yeah,
to a
yeah.
place like maybe going to a
Even
place like
even
Balogun
even
Market.
e-commerce apps and whatever now do market runs for you.
Exactly, and
Mhm.
all of this because the actual experience is so unpleasant that people are not willing to pay somebody else to do it for them. So, one of the things I always think about is that a, an organizing principle, a guiding principle for anybody who wants to be a leader in a place like Lagos is that you want to say things like just improve livability. The day-to-day experience of a Lagosian. Somebody leaves their house, they're going to the office. Everything that happens along the way, from there, if I can improve it, then I can get a more productive worker in the office. So that means you have to start thinking about things like transport infrastructure or just generally that if I improve the conditions in the market for the traders and for the shoppers, then I mean, what kind of boost in terms of the actual volume of trade can I get or can ancillary services happen there? So if a market becomes a more pleasant experience, somebody can go there and you don't even have to buy anything. You can just go there and just eat or just do something else or just walk around. Can a market become a place where people can actually just visit and just walk around? I mean, I go to the mall. People go to the malls. In Western countries, going to the mall is an activity on its own.
Yeah.
People and a lot of malls are set up whereby even if you're not buying anything there, there's something for you to do. So I mean, recently I was in the United States with my family, and you know one of the things we did was we visited several malls. We did shopping, but at the same time, just looking around was just part of the activity. or just sitting down somewhere, buying ice cream or eating. I mean, in the malls, you have a whole food court area whereby, okay, fine, even if you just came to look around and all that kind of stuff. So, if you make the experience better, the experience of living better, if you take that as your motivation for doing anything, just to make the experience of doing anything just better. I mean, Lagos, I mean, even finding trees.
I mean, to give you an idea of what of course, you've lived in Lagos, but you don't live in Lagos currently. To give you an idea, Lagos does infrastructure projects every year. Every government that wins an election engages in incredible amount of infrastructure projects, bridges, whatever, uh, train tracks, trains. But I mean, a few days ago, Friday, there were heavy rains, and this is like the natural experience. Heavy rains, heavy flooding in almost everywhere in Lagos, and people have to spend an inordinate, ungodly amount of hours in traffic. You have people getting home from work at midnight and even way past that because simply the roads, the neighborhoods are flooded. The drainages are not working. I take your point on livability, but where I'm sort of pushing at is that we know that our political elites or whatever it is we choose to call them, I don't know. They are not people that think about these kind of things. Like, you wake up in the morning and you think like what would make the experience of the average Lagosian livable. It's not really our thing. So uh, I want to know, like, what are the other levers that you think other stakeholders, citizens in the system can push, at least maybe to, force things a little bit, because I don't know if it is ignorance or incompetence or just incentives. Our political elites are very reluctant to use markets. The regulatory instinct is almost always about rent or sometimes just needless cruelty. So, I mean, if we take something like deforestation, and it's not as if the ideas are not there if you look at the works of Elinor Ostrom and a lot of all these other people. Deforestation is a problem that so many countries are solving by creating a secondary market in tree planting. Just sometimes you make things profitable. Sometimes you open up new economic opportunities to solve a problem. That's the whole point of market creation, to solve a problem rather than just ban this, ban that, go to jail, pay fine, whatever, which is like our good solutions, which is usually just to create more rent for government. So other stakeholders in the society, especially if you think about the role of the domestic merchants in the early Lagos and the role they played in keeping that market, for however briefly it existed, in roughly 2 decades, going. What can we learn from that experience?
So it's a very interesting point. Like, one thing I read some years ago, it was an article in the FT, somebody said the Chinese said the Communist Party decided that, look, even if we hate markets, they it is because we hate it that we need to understand it. So, like physics, so whether you like an aeroplane or not, if you want to make an aeroplane, you need to understand physics. So they set themselves the task of actually fundamentally underlying or understanding the workings of how the market works. So, I mean, when you look at Lagos and you think about, what were the levers, it was an opportunity for people to get rich.
Mm.
And this is something that appeals to humans anyway. People were able to get rich under new rules, in the sense that the rules allowed even people who had previously been rich but who could see the signs that the end was near. The end was in sight for slavery, and there was just no, the new guns in town, like you said, after 1861, after bombarding Lagos, and the new hegemon, everyone riding around and say, okay, this is the guy with the biggest gun in town. He can destroy everybody, and the person has said no more slavery. So where are we going to go? And the person didn't just say, stop slave trading. If I catch you, I'll shoot you. And just walk away. The person actually made a serious effort to swap out that trade with something legitimate. And I guess in this case, in the sense that if you look at the British people, the British authorities, the colonial as the government, then they are the ones who kind of like offered this new carrot and said, look, if you come along this way, then you can get rich. And people started to get rich. We saw several examples already in the book of people getting fabulously wealthy. I mean, JPL Davis, it's not quite clear how he made his money, but it is clear that he made money and he was trading.
Yeah.
He wasn't a government official, so money had come from somewhere, and he had risen very, very rapidly to the top of society. That sort of thing. Taiwo Olowo, Oshodi Takwa, all these people, they made money, and the rules were clear in the sense that, if you had an aptitude for this thing, if you had an aptitude for trade, recognizing opportunities and all that, you could deal with people far away. You could improve your own condition. And there were many others who became wealthy, who never did slavery. In fact, some of them were previous slaves or the descendants of slaves from the Saro side. So I think there is no getting around the incentive for people to want to improve the condition of their fellow citizens. Unfortunately, like you said, it's not our thing. It has to be our thing, And there's one article I read many years ago, David Oyelowo's movie about Seretse Kama.
Okay.
Came out, and then somebody was talking about one guy was talking about how when he was a student, university student, and they were teaching them about Seretse Kama and how the guy basically institutionalized the whole diamond industry in Botswana and somehow helped Botswana escape the fate of what you might expect of any resource extraction play. And by the time the professor finished and was talking to the class, somebody was now like saying, so a student was now asking that, okay, but why did he do that? Like, why wasn't he like all the other people who pocketed all the diamond wealth for themselves? Why did he? He said the professor was exasperated, and after a while, the professor just said, you know what? Sometimes people are good, and that was the answer I had, So there is no getting around that. If you are a leader, you have to look at the condition of your people and say, I want to improve that. If you don't have that, then you shouldn't be a leader in the first place. But even if you are a leader, then it just means that the people are going nowhere underneath you. So you mentioned trees. This is something that is kind of like easiest to do. You go around Lagos and there's just no shade. There's no carbon soak.
Yeah.
I'm not a tree hugging environmentalist, but living in the has really taught me the value of trees. And I see them planting trees all over the place. Every time is a deliberate act,
You really don't have to be a tree hugger. You really don't have to be a tree hugger. One phrase I like to use is that Lagos is a naked city. Like, exactly. There are no shades anywhere.
Mm-hmm.
One of the
ways by which the UK replanted itself when it lost. So in the old days, when they used to fight all the Napoleonic wars, those trees were the ships were all made of wood at the time, and the more wars you were fighting, this triggered a lot of deforestation, and the government then created a kind of market for wealthy people to plant trees in exchange for honors, and all of a sudden it became almost kind of like a competition to rich people, and I think maybe they got some tax breaks and all that, but it was just in a very, very short period of time, the incentives were so great that a lot of reforestation quickly happened. We have a lot of rich people in Nigeria. You can use you can use you have the honor system, which is just wasted, or just use something, or even maybe a tactic like plant trees, just so that let life be a bit a bit better. But you have to start thinking about, because the reason for planting a tree is not obvious. I mean, who cares? Like planting a tree, why would you? But you have to want to make the experience of living in your city better for people, in the sense that you provide shade, you provide a defense against flooding, you provide a defense against carbon, that sort of thing. That has to be the starting point. When you then think about it, that okay, I want to make life better for people, in the sense that, I mean, I always remember a couple of years ago, I was in Lagos. A friend took me out somewhere in Lekki, and we were only there in a restaurant. We were only there for an hour and a half or 2 hours. By the time we got out of, to enter her car, she parked her car just across the road. It was in the afternoon, maybe like 1 o'clock. I mean, when we got to that car, it was like a sauna, and we had to basically open the doors of the car, leave it open for a few minutes, just for us, before you could even get inside. And she was not like, look, this is Lagos for you. Can you see any tree around you? And I didn't really thought about it, and I looked around. There was not a tree in sight. So, I mean, if there were trees there, I mean, she could, just park your car under the tree, at least a bit of the shade, so you don't come back into a boiling hot car, and then when you are now driving, because the car is so hot, you now turn on your air conditioning full blast, and then you're pouring more carbon into the air. Say, okay, for every 1,000 trees you plant, you will get some kind of government, whatever, or you get some kind of credit. I don't know. Like, you could get to the front of the queue of getting your CFO or something, which is in the governor's power. That okay, if you plant 1,000 trees, you will get 24-hour service for CFO request or that kind of thing. And there's just so many ways you can do. But the first principle is the first principle. I want to make life better, and planting trees might make that happen. How do we incentivize that to happen? You don't have to do it as a government project where you now start giving contract for $1 billion to start planting trees, and then all of that. So yes, I think we've been doing this for over an hour. I thought we planned that we'll do 30 minutes, but I think this has been a good discussion.
30 minutes, so
So hopefully,
but
we'll do more as well as we go deeper into the book. We'll discuss some other points. But this has been a good chat, and I think and then we'll see how people like this, and then listeners, viewers, if you enjoy this, let us know, and then Toby and I will continue to find time to talk more about it. But hopefully this has been a useful listen for you. An hour, 10 hours, an hour plus of your time. We'll put a link to all the books we talked about. We'll put them in the notes to this podcast. Hopefully we'll take it from there.
Yeah, bonus question for you, though, Faye, because I've entered my podcast interviewer mode here. So you and I, we've been sort of having this light. It hasn't really gotten heavy, maybe because we haven't done it in print. Debate about like what really has more influence on the should I say the structure or the direction of the economy? Is it culture or some other underlying incentives? So that point you mentioned, like we know that culture is also about beliefs, right? So that belief that it's okay for people living in a certain territory over which I rule to get rich, right? Where does it come from? That spirit of, letting no bad belly if people make money, from, just doing regular things. They don't have to know me. There doesn't have to be any golden handshakes. We don't have to do backroom deals. Like, it's okay for people to, just get rich. That belief, where does it really come from? There's something that my partner Ronke usually says that is like seared in my brain, which I think should be like a guiding principle for governments. And she always said that never destroy value. Whatever it is you you do, never destroy value, you know. And I look at the rubbish they did with the landmark thing and so many other, like that guy basically, like him or hate him, whatever, basically turned that entire stretch of the coast into a very, very profitable, popular. I'm not talking in terms of his balance sheet, of course, but a very popular tourist attraction and
Giving people
destination.
access to the coast, which is what you really want in coastal
Yes,
town.
yes, yes, yes. So, and I know people want to get smart and legalese about their argument. Oh, you can't privatize the beaches, but we know the state of public beaches in Lagos before private beaches came on board. The standard practice is you go, you pay some kind of illegal informal fees anyways, and the chances of you being harassed or
Very
sitting
high.
next to people who are smoking marijuana is very
Or even
high.
a church. Like, yeah.
Yeah, people who came to do Iwe or sacrifice or whatever, you know.
That kind of stuff.
So yeah, so like some people saw a business opportunity, like create this space, will charge a small fee for people to use, which nobody has ever complained that they mind paying, but that belief or culture of not destroying value simply because you think you can or because you want to reallocate it to some, because like you have to have some kind of positive sum outlook in life, that the fact that somebody else is making it does not mean I can't make it. The fact that somebody else is making there's enough to go around. So that belief, where can you even speculatively, where does it come from?
So this is a tough question. Like, I remember Professor Deirdre McCloskey's book, The Bourgeois Equality. She talks about this a lot in the sense that she calls it the three acts. You know, I get rich in the first, the capitalist or whatever. I get rich, and then once I get rich, then the fruit of my whatever percolates downward, and then the third act is everybody gets rich. You know, and by that it doesn't really matter. You know, in
Hmm.
the sense that you can teach it. You know, it can be infused into whatever your culture is. You can plant it in your education system. You know, I mean, America, for example, the idea that you could make yourself into something, a lot of it came out of the books that were called Horatio Alger. You know, so these were almost kind of like comic story books in the sense, and it just started to give a lot of people belief that, you know, somebody born in poverty, it had no bearing on where you could get in life. You could work hard, you know, build yourself up, and you become good. So all those kind of things were as important as what people were taught in schools. In the sense that this was the education of people, and it just became cultural, and then you find a lot of people striving to to better themselves. So where it comes from, I think part of our issue is that so much of people's worth or sense of self worth or prestige or whatever is just tied to money, you know, to the point whereby if you don't have money, you are almost a non human.
Hmm.
Again, I don't want to always reach for slave trade as my go to answer for everything. For everything, but when you've had a culture where people were selling their fellow humans, you know, I mean, I look at Britain here, you know, Rule Britannia is a popular song, right? Popular folk song and everything. And you know, one of the one of the parts, the lines in it goes, "Britain shall never ever shall be slaves." And I just thought to myself, every time I listen to that, I just wish that, you know what, I wish my people had a national song like that that
Hmm.
said, "Nigeria shall never ever shall be slaves." And there's some hypocrisy in it. I mean, the British were happy to sell, you know, buy and sell trade, but they said to themselves that Britons shall never ever shall be slaves, and and it just leads to, it makes a point in the sense that you obviously see your fellow human, money or no money, as somebody that cannot be traded. So you've imbued a baseline level of dignity in your fellow human, you know. But if you see your human as another commodity that you can just be sold to whoever, I mean, you're certainly a slave. You don't even know where he's going or what is going to be done with him. You know, we've and I don't know. I don't want to draw a strong connection between that and now. I don't know if that I don't know where it comes from, in the sense that why do we tie so much of human value to money or worth, in the sense that if you don't have money, you are an unperson. You're not a person. And I think fundamentally that is the challenge. And this is also the reason why I say it's fixable. You can begin to teach and imbibe in people that as a human being, there is just a baseline a baseline level of dignity that you have that is non-negotiable. That whether you have 1 naira to your name or 1 billion, at a certain level, that's who you are. And no, nothing can that be taken away from you. From that point of view, once you begin to see your fellow human as a certain level, as your equal, and you realize that you yourself, as a person, your worth is not really tied to how much money you have. Because if you begin to think that your worth is tied to how much money you have, then you are getting into a zero sum game, in the sense that if another person has money, then it affects you. It affects who you are. And I think fundamentally that is just the challenge, whereby in societies where people have imbued humans with a certain level of dignity, I think it makes it much easier for you to live and let live, and just let another person make money. It doesn't disturb me. It doesn't take away from the intrinsic value I have. So if you have 1 billion, I have $100. It doesn't mean that you can just come and slap me or lock me up in jail just because you have more money than I am. So, again, whatever the source is, whatever the reason for it is, the quote unquote good news is that it is definitely fixable if we put our minds to it and we start to think about how we imbue this in people from, as Professor Deidre Marcosi says, from when the child is sitting on his or her mother's laps. That is when the education starts. From there, and if anything you educate a child from at that point in time and they grew up with it, it never leaves them.
I want to be provocative for a minute. You've obviously done a lot of research. You're the historian in this pair. Did we have a slave market in Nigeria before we started selling our people to foreigners? I know there was slavery, but was there slave trade, and how big was it internally?
So calling it a trade is giving it it's putting too fine a point on it. But basically what it was, in fact, it was actually the lack of markets that made the system so violent. Right? So, and the example I've always used is that if you wanted slaves, if you needed slaves when you were during the slave period, if you wanted slaves in Georgia, for example, there were slave markets in America. You go there, pay your money, you buy the slave. You can't just go and capture people from another place. And those slaves were property. If your slave escaped, then they could be captured and returned to you. But so you couldn't just go and raid a village. Say because I needed 100 slaves, and then you just go and raid one village in Virginia or something, and they just capture people and just enslave them. This is, I mean, it probably happened at a lower level, but but what we had in Nigeria was that the system of catching slaves was pure violence, right? So you go and raid a village, capture them, and a way was a you Hugh Thomas has a book called The Slave Trade, which is pretty much one of the best authorities on the slave trade. Well, one of the things he mentioned was that by the time a slave got to the coast in Nigeria, and what we know as Nigeria today, by the time he got to the coast, it could have changed hands 50 times. You know, so it wasn't like there wasn't so much as a fixed market. So somebody just captured maybe just a long forgotten skirmish, one random buyer for something, that person sold you, until you found yourself at the coast, and then you were sold off and maybe ended up in Brazil or America. I mean, someone like Jerry Crowder is probably a good example. He says that there was a war that was fought in Egbala, and he was caught. The person who caught him needed a horse, and they saw an opportunity to buy a horse, and he just gave Crowder to the owner of the horse, and they collected the horse, and and Crowder was then sold to maybe multiple people, and then kept in Lagos waiting for the ships, the Royal Navy ships to pass. And then once they pass, they put them on a boat trying to smuggle them elsewhere. But luckily for Crowder, the Royal Navy ship came back, and then they caught the boat and then freed all of them, carried them to Sierra Leone. So that was just it wasn't like a market per se, in the sense that when he was captured in that war, they didn't take him to a slave market and do an auction for him. Just the person just needed whoever captured him or owned him at that time just needed a horse, and the person exchanged. So, but we didn't really have slave markets like that, in the sense that it was just basically people were captured, exchanged for whatever they needed for, transported multiple times, and then they ended up at the coast. So the closest thing you had to a market was maybe the port, when the European traders came and said, okay, this is what we want this one, we want that one, and then we'll buy them, and then but that was just a coastal activity, wasn't? But where the actual supply was coming from was never really, I mean, Sultan, the Sultan of Sokoto at the time, they had annual slave raiding expedition. It was almost kind of like a seasonal thing where they would go on their horses, go and raid an area, capture the slaves, and then bring them back. So again, this is another indicator of how incompatible the slave trade and everything that came with it could just not work with legitimate commerce. And maybe that's why we're still struggling, but in the sense that, if you are doing slave business, you couldn't just port from there. And which is why the people like Taiwo Olowo and Oshodi Tapa who did it are probably remarkable, because to go from doing this kind of crazy business and then trying to do something legitimate was quite a different world. I mean, palm oil, you couldn't just apply the same principles to palm oil. Just somebody who plant the palm oil and they just go there and just raid their farm, carry all the palm oil. You have to start actually respecting the person you are trading with, in the sense that. So I think to answer your question, that I think that was it didn't have markets that were compatible. The trade, we call it a trade, but again, this goes back to your earlier point about how people have always traded, but markets are a completely different thing.
Yeah, this was fun.
Yeah. Oh.
Yeah.
Okay. Right. So yeah, we'll catch up again on this, and then we'll continue our reading. To everyone who's listening, if you've made it this far, I commend you. 1 hour 30 minutes. Hopefully we've made it worth your time. And then we'll catch up with you again soon. Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening. Cheers. Thanks, Obi.
Cheers, Siri. Thank you.